Hey everyone, welcome back to another Widen Woodworks video. I'm Jeremy, and today I want to walk you through how I made this custom ordered cutting board. We just relaunched my website, and this is the first order to come off of that. Make sure you stay tuned to the end of the video to find out how to get your own custom pieces. Cutting boards can be super complex to make, requiring a bunch of different glue-ups and a ton of sanding, but they can also be made more simply in just a few steps. My buddy Andy has wanted a cutting board for a while, and after talking with him a bit, we decided on this simple design. This edge grain board uses strips of padauk, cherry, and walnut in a way that's really economical for material. It only requires a few tools and can be done in just a weekend. Let's get into the project. I went down to Rockler to pick up some S4S boards. By working with material that has already been milled and surfaced, you can cut out a lot of the working time. I decided on padauk, cherry, and walnut boards because the grain structures and the colors work really well together. The cutting board is 12 inches long, so I started by cross-cutting the material down to 13 inches. This would give me leeway to clean up the ends after gluing the boards together. I used my miter saw for this, but it can also be done with a table saw or even a circular saw or jigsaw. With the pieces down to rough length, I could take them to the table saw to cut strips. I'm using the edge grain of the wood for the surface of the cutting boards, so the strips I'm cutting are going to determine the thickness of the board. I was aiming for about 1 1/4 inch in overall thickness, so I cut the strips to 1 1/2 inches wide. Then with the strips cut, I could arrange them on top of my bar clamps to glue them up. I used Titebond 3 wood glue because it's mostly waterproof, so the cutting board will hold up to being washed. I applied the glue using a brush, then clamped them together. I made sure to clamp from both the top and the bottom so that there weren't any gaps. And I used cawls to keep the strips aligned to reduce the amount of planing and sanding I would have to do. These cawls are just 2x2 boards with packing tape on them so they won't get glued to the piece itself. Then I used a wet rag to clean up any glue squeeze out. I let the glue dry overnight and then removed the board from the clamps. I used a chisel to remove any larger chunks of dried glue so that they wouldn't gum up the blades in my planer when I planed them down to thickness. To clean the surfaces of the cutting board, I made multiple passes through my planer. I always make sure to only take off about a 32nd of an inch or less at a time. My planer has 2 speed settings, one for dimensioning and one for finishing. I started with the slower dimensioning speed so that I could get the board down to 1 1/4 inches. Then I made a couple passes at the finishing speed so that the surface was as clean as possible. I used a miter gauge on my table saw to clean up the ends of the cutting board and bring it to its final length of 12 inches. Then I traced a line around the corners of the board so that I could round them off. I used my bandsaw to cut the corners out, and I'll sand them down to final shape later. You could also use a jigsaw for this, or a router with a corner edge guide, or a disc sander with a square table. Then I measured and marked where I wanted the cutout for the handle to be. I brought it over to my drill press and used a 1-inch Forstner bit to drill out holes to make the handle. I used a combination square to scribe a line where I would need to cut for the rest of it. Normally I would use a jigsaw to cut along the line and connect the 2 holes, but I had lent mine to a friend, which left me with chisels to hog out the material. This was a lot slower of a process, but I could always use more practice with chisels. To make the job easier, I took the board back to the drill press and drilled out more of the handle material. I just took my time and made sure not to go beyond the boundaries of the lines I drew. Once I had the area cleared out, I used a series of rasps and files to smooth down the inside of the handle. With the board in its mostly final shape, I could start sanding. I used 80 grit paper in my random orbit sander to start smoothing the surfaces and to finish rounding over the corners of the board. Then I worked my way through 120 grit and 220 grit paper. Before doing the final bit of sanding, I took the opportunity to round over all the edges of the board, including inside the handle. I chucked a 1/4 inch round over bit into my palm router and went over both sides of the cutting board. You could ease over the edges with sandpaper and get a similar look, but I prefer how the routed edges come out. With the edges routed, I moved on to sanding with 400 grit sandpaper. I also hand sanded with 220 and then 400 grit paper on the inside of the handle. Before applying finish to the board, I wiped the whole thing down with a wet towel. Doing this raises the grain on the wood. Then I repeated the process of sanding and wiping until the grain no longer raised after wiping it down. By doing this cycle of sanding and wiping, the surface will remain smoother for longer and won't absorb as much liquid. Now with the sanding done, I could apply some finish. This is a cutting board, so it needs to be food safe, so I used butcher block conditioner to finish the board. I applied a heavy layer and let it soak in for about 20 minutes, then wiped off the excess. And I kept applying layers until the conditioner no longer soaked into the wood. With the final coat of the conditioner dry, the cutting board is done. I love how the finish makes the padauk and the walnut pop. And the way all three woods play together makes the board look more complex than it really is. An edge grain cutting board like this is super easy to customize with different woods, sizes, and patterns. And they make for great accent pieces in a kitchen while still being functional. My wife and I have been working hard to update and relaunch my website. We've added a gallery of past projects, an online shop, and a custom order form. So if you want a custom piece like this, now it's just a click away. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, feel free to like and subscribe so you don't miss any future content, and I'll see you next time.